Two different cults. Two different leaders. One similarly devastating result.
Good evening. A heavily armed compound, a religious cult, their leader claiming to be Jesus Christ.
My feeling is most cult leaders are some form of sociopath.
I'll tell you about a kingdom level beyond here.
You're in the reality of the cult leader's world, and nothing else really matters to you.
Do you believe that Koresh was the Messiah?
I think he was a Messiah.
It's free will that is dominated by the will of the leader.
If you don't follow the truth, you're going to hell!
We were martyrs for the revolution, right? So we saw ourselves as martyrs, and of course martyrs are supposed to suffer.
Hello and welcome again to Cults and Conspiracies, our live exploration into the who, what, where, and why regarding cult groups. Even though cults are part of the general zeitgeist, they remain a mystery in many ways. Why would you drink the Kool-Aid? Why would you stab a pregnant Sharon Tate? It takes an almost unimaginable degree of resolve to leave a cult, and in many cases the survivors have become so detached from the real world that they face being ostracized, threats, harassment, and culture shock. Our guest today is one such survivor. For those of you unfamiliar with the cult Children of God, we've put together the following video for reference.
Okay, we're back. There's gotta be a way. There's gotta be a way how one person can stand up to a group. And I found that equalizer in edged weapons.
The Children of God cult was founded by charismatic pastor David Berg, later known as Moses David. He preached a message of free love, but in reality, he promoted abuse and held total sexual control over his cult members. Nothing was off limits: adultery, group sex, incest, and even pedophilia, as long as the cult continued to grow.
How can you do that to kids? How can you do that to kids and sleep at night?
Their main recruitment practice was known as flirty fishing, an elegant term for forced prostitution of young women.
God damn it, that was nasty.
Amongst their most disturbing moments, the cult published a 762-page book with sexually explicit photos of an underage Ricky Rodriguez.
Nobody deserved that. Especially not a kid that age. God damn.
Fleur Edwards is a survivor of the apocalyptic cult The Family International, otherwise known as Children of God. Fleur and her family of 12 children left when she was 13, having all been born and raised in the family. She now works in education and is in the process of writing a memoir about growing up in the Children of God, which will be slated for release at the end of this year or early next from Turner Publishing. Fleur, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I really appreciate it. So let's get right into the questions, shall we? In your words, what was the Children of God, and who was David Berg, the charismatic leader behind it?
Okay. The Children of God was actually a very small hippie movement that started on the shores of Huntington Beach in 1968. It was a group of people that were responding to the political climate of the time. I always say if you grew up in the 60s, or if you were a young person in the 60s or 70s and you did not join a cult or a band, then you didn't really live through the 60s or the 70s. So a lot of people were joining cults at that time, including my parents. So David Brant Berg was the leader of the Children of God. He was a very interesting character, I like to think of. He was the son of an evangelical preacher. He came from a long line of evangelists dating back to the 1700s. There tended to be a trend of people in his ancestry getting ostracized from the traditional church, and that applied to him as well. His parents were kicked out of a group called, I believe it was the Disciples for Christ, for claiming a miracle of divine healing. His mother was bedridden and supposed to die from an accident that she had, and she one morning walked off her deathbed and straight to the pulpit, and she started to claim that she was divinely healed. The church, that did not sit well with the church, so they kicked them out of the church and they started their own ministry. Father David wanted to follow in his mother's footsteps. He sort of idolized her. And when he was young, he was also sort of ostracized from the church, and that's when he decided to start his own movement. He actually started it right when his mother died. So I think there was some sort of, he wanted to sort of do what she did in his own way. So that's how he started it. And it started out as a very sort of, I always like to say, humble and innocent movement. It didn't start out as a cult, as most cults do. They don't start out, oh, let's start a cult, you know. They start out with some sort of a purpose, usually. And the people who join them are looking for some sort of purpose, some sense of belonging, some sense of community. And that's why people do get involved with cults.
Very interesting. Now, you've obviously had a lot of firsthand experience with this in your time since and during, but I'm wondering, back in the past, going into your backstory a bit, how did your parents initially fall into the Children of God, and what was it like for you growing up within the confines of this group?
Okay. So my parents both had two different stories. My mom's from Sweden. My dad's actually from Pasadena. My dad was the sixth eldest of 9, and all of his older siblings joined. So he sort of just followed along. Again, I think a lot of people who joined cults at that time, it was sort of a peer pressure thing. He joined, I believe, here in Southern California. My mom was more of a free spirit, living in Sweden, sort of experimenting with different, avenues of experimentation. And she was traveling one day and she met someone from the Children of God, and it really resonated with her. And she just decided to join. A lot of people, when they joined, they would literally drop everything right there and, just join the group. One big thing that Father David was trying to do was give people a way to follow God without having to adhere to the sort of traditional outlines of the church. So that's where a lot of his sort of free practices and rules came in, because he thought that the way the church was functioning was sort of like an old model, and he kind of had this, like, what he thought was a fresh new idea, and this really resonated with a lot of people. A lot of people in the 60s, they were experimenting with drugs, they were experimenting with sex, they were doing all sorts of things. So to have a group come in and say, hey, you can do all of this, but you can also serve God, was very, very popular for them.
Well, that stands to reason. But when you were growing up, what was it like being raised in that kind of environment with those kind of rules?
Yeah, when I was very young, I just remember traveling a lot. So I spent a few years in California. We lived in campgrounds. One thing about the Children of God is they didn't have a lot of money, so it wasn't like we had the means to just go and do whatever we wanted. They did believe the world was ending. I remember knowing about that when I was about 5 years old. So that was very prominent in my mind of what was going to happen, that when I was 12, the world was going to end. When I was 5, my family moved to Thailand. So the leader had a vision or a prophecy, however you want to call it. He often would, he believed he was God's sort of middleman, right? He spoke to God and then spoke to the people, which a lot of prophets from, the past, that's how they would gather their groups, their followers. And so he would have these visions or these prophecies, and then he would relay them to his followers, and everyone would just, like, in an instant do exactly what he said. So around 1984, early 80s, he did have a vision that the West was evil and everyone needed to move out of the West, because when the end came, it was going to be the first one in line for God's judgment. So at that point, my family moved to Thailand. Most of the followers at that time were in third world countries, so either Southeast Asia, South America, or even Africa. But he basically moved everyone out of the West, so out of Europe, out of North America.
And most of those followers were Westerners, as in they weren't
Exactly.
natives of those countries or places. Okay.
Yeah, most of them were American or European.
I see. Interesting. So I know in relation to the Children of God, there have been a lot of sort of horror stories involving physical, like sexual abuse and things of that nature that were apparently rampant among many of the members. Did you bear witness directly to any of that, or were you too young, or were you isolated from it in some way?
Yeah, I was born a little bit later. So in the beginning, there was a lot of that. I've heard stories of it. I've actually spoken to girls who witnessed it. I spoke to a woman who actually lived in Father David's home. And she did explain to me what happened there. And he did have these free sexual beliefs. He believed that people needed to have sort of like a sexual revolution, and it needed to happen very young. So he considered young children to be adults at the age of 12, and he would have them engage in activities that usually people wait till they're full adults. By the time I was born, they had stricter rules because there was a lot of bad publicity. There was they would have raids of some of the homes, and the leaders of the group decided, to sort of get a little bit stricter on how they would practice those beliefs.
Interesting. And Father David, how do you know how he was curbed? If that was what he believed in, or was it other members of the group exerting influence over him and telling him that he needed to calm it down, or
he was the ultimate authority,
right?
And that's one characteristic of a cult is that the leader does have complete control. It's concentrated power in the hands of one. So that's what makes a cult very unique. There were layers of leadership, but the leaders didn't have nearly as much power as Father David had.
I see. So it was ultimately his call
Yes,
in every respect.
It was his call, yes.
So you talked briefly on the sort of apocalyptic vision that David Berg had. So when you were a kid growing up, what were your feelings regarding the apocalypse, which I believe is due to happen in 1993, correct? And then when that year came and went, how did that impact the way you saw the belief system?
Yeah, that's always a hot question. People always want to know what happened when it didn't come, as if there was a day that we were waiting for, and when it didn't happen, we were all sitting around waiting for the end to come. And it didn't quite happen like that. There were also times along the way when Father David's his prophecies would not come to pass quite as he had said. He would have public apologies about it and say, hey, I was wrong, or hey, I messed up. I think when the apocalypse didn't come like he had predicted it, he actually told his followers that God was giving us an extension because we were doing such good work. So that was sort of his excuse. For me, I was becoming a teenager. I just moved back to the States. I was 12 years old. I think the time that I thought about it most was when I was much younger. And as we approached closer and closer to it, I was just a kid, wanting to, be popular with other kids, or, just having the normal anxieties and fears of a teenager, a young girl as a teenager. So those were my main concerns. I think a lot of the followers did know that Father David had, made a serious mistake.
So you wouldn't say that there was any one turning point necessarily in your development while you were still involved, while your family was still involved with Children of God, when you started to see things differently or started to question, or was it more of it's a gradual
It was
process?
gradual. It started when I was young, and I would have these sort of almost maternal instincts for my siblings, and I would see them getting punished. Even though I wasn't witness to sexual abuse, I did see a lot of physical abuse. So they were very strict on the children because of what we were in for. They believed that they were raising an army for the end of the world. So they sort of had a very strict schedule from morning to night of what we could and could not do. Father David always made his followers look inside themselves. That's what a narcissist does. They, instead of having the attention be on them, they deflect it back to someone else. Some people call it projection. And so all the adults did that, and then they would do it to us kids. So from a very young age, I was always being told everything was our fault. When something happened, it was our fault. So they would punish us a lot. And so I would see these kids being punished, and I knew in my gut this was wrong. I thankfully had some sisters with me, and we were able to talk about it, but it was blasphemous to say anything against authority in the group.
That's fascinating. Well, in case you are just joining us, you are currently watching Cults and Conspiracies live on Super News. I'm your host, Dash Finley, and my guest today is Fleur Edwards, a former member of the Children of God cult. Now, if you're not aware of that group, we have a little video clip that we'll play to reiterate you, and we'll discuss it further when we get back.
Okay, we're back. There's gotta be a way. There's gotta be a way how one person can stand up to a group. And I found that equalizer in edged weapons.
The Children of God cult was founded by charismatic pastor David Berg, later known as Moses David. He preached a message of free love, but in reality, he promoted abuse and held total sexual control over his cult members. Nothing was off limits: adultery, group sex, incest, and even pedophilia, as long as the cult continued to grow.
How can you do that to kids? How can you do that to kids and sleep at night?
Their main recruitment practice was known as flirty fishing, an elegant term for forced prostitution of young women.
God damn it, that was nasty.
Amongst their most disturbing moments, the cult published a 762-page book with sexually explicit photos of an underage Ricky Rodriguez.
Nobody deserved that. Especially not a kid that age. God damn.
I'm Aaron Paul from The Path, and you're watching Cults and Conspiracies.
Wow, it's pretty powerful stuff. So, Fleur, why exactly did your parents eventually come to leave Children of God? And why were you and your sister, were they involved at all in this decision?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what was...
Yeah, so the leader died a year after his predicted apocalypse. So in 1994, I believe, he died after he had sent all his followers back to the Western countries. And you have to understand, most of the adults had been out of society for 25 years. They had no education, they had no money, they had no experience, and they had a bunch of children. And then Father David decided to up and leave the third world countries and head back to the US and Europe. My family moved to Chicago. About a year later, the leader died from, I believe it was shingles. He had some health problems. And when the leader died, because he did hold all the power, the entire group was, in my view, dismantled. His wife tried to take leadership, but she couldn't. She sent out a letter of rules for all the followers, which gave everyone a bunch of freedom. So my family was kind of abandoned when I was around 12, 13 years old. Everyone dispersed and decided to go and kind of make their own lives. The big families were kind of left to their own because no one really wanted to stay and help them. We were lucky to find people who did help us outside of the group, and we lived in Chicago for about a year. After that, we moved out to California, and that's when my brother left, and us girls decided that we want to go to school. So yes, we were involved in the decision to leave.
Interesting. And your parents were willing to admit that there was a compromise between
Luckily, yes, my parents did put us kids first, and we were quite young. Some parents did not. They said, okay, go out and make it on your own. A lot of families actually did that. Whereas my parents did decide to leave with us, which I always admired them for, and is one reason why I'm not holding a bunch of ill will towards them.
Yes, well, that's probably for the best.
Yeah.
There were no divisions, familial divisions, although it did happen, as you said. So during this process of, let's call it integration, when you were sort of getting into normal society, what was it like adjusting? What was the hardest thing that you had to get used to?
Everything. It was, I mean, I always say it wasn't so much growing up in a cult that was difficult, it was coming out of the cult. I mean, they did create, although it was you hear the horror stories of what went on in the Children of God, but they also created sort of a utopia for us where we were looking forward to this heaven. And even amidst the abuse and the discipline, there was this like sense of love and, oh, you belong here, because that's what cults create. They create a sense of belonging. So the difficult part wasn't so much growing up. The really difficult part was leaving the group. And I mean everything about it, the social aspect of it, so obviously the financial aspect of it, education. I mean, I didn't have any schooling my whole life, and all of a sudden, you know, I was starting high school. I would say if I had to pick one, I would say the social part, because, you know, as a young teenager, who doesn't care about what other people think of them? And immediately I'm surrounded by people who look like foreigners to me. And that was very, very difficult for me to try to fit in. I had to make up stories about my past for a long time. But that was, I mean, I could talk about that for a long time. But eventually I found, you know, ways to cope with it and heal from it.
So in terms of that social difficulty, were there certain traits or behaviors that would have been normalized in Children of God that then seemed odd when you were doing it in a more normal context?
I don't think I have any specifics about that. I think mainly it was just the background where people would ask me, where are you from? I mean, even now when people ask me where I'm from, it's always a difficult conversation to have. So, you know, the normal stories that you hear, those are the exotic stories to me, where I'm like, oh my God, this is so interesting. So I think mainly it was the where do you come from story that was hard for me to grapple with.
Yeah, I can imagine why. So looking back on that experience growing up within the confines of Children of God, do you harbor any kind of ill will towards your parents? I know you said that they did do a sight better than some of the other families by not splitting you apart in that way, but do you ever have any kind of resentment for the situation that they put you and your sister in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's normal to feel like your parents, obviously their job is to raise you, and I think it also depends on where I'm at in my life. So when things seem to be going really well, and you know, I have made some progress in my life, and I've done quite a bit considering where I've come from. But then there are times when I do have to figure things out. I always say my learning curve is much higher, and from the outside it looks maybe like I have it all together, or I just look like a normal person, but it is a little bit like dealing a little bit with a disability on some level, because you are constantly having to figure everything out that is still unfamiliar, even though I've been out for so long. And you know, it doesn't stop, even when time passes. There's still always things that you have to keep relearning that are sort of so embedded in your psyche. So yeah, there's times when I'm upset, but I think the thing is to put it into perspective. And I always think, who really knows if they're doing the best thing for their children? You know, when my parents joined and when they started to raise us, they thought that was the best thing for us. You know, obviously looking back now, it wasn't. But yeah, at the time, people did things like that, you know.
Exactly. Well, things are the way they were, and there's no way to really go back on it. So, but it seems like things have worked out for the best in your case overall. So, if there was a takeaway from your years living among the Children of God that had any positive effect, was there anything that you felt was actually made any improvement on your life in today's context?
I mean, yeah. You have to understand, we grew up from the outside, you're looking at all the ways that things were different for us. But there was also, we were cut off from so much that is also really bad for you know, children growing up. Like, even in our diet, we were not allowed to have any sugar. We were not exposed to any media at all. So we didn't have, you know, the way children grow up now when they're inundated with so much information, I think it can get very confusing for them. When I did come out and I did start going to school, I was actually very sharp in school. I was taken to every subject. And I think that's because I didn't have all the other limitations. And even with writing, I grew up not knowing I knew how to read and write, but I wasn't allowed to. And I decided that I wanted to be a writer. And when I talk to people who also want to be writers, one of the biggest obstacles they face is that people told them that they couldn't. You know, their grammar teachers told them that they couldn't. And I never had anyone telling me that I couldn't. So I just went straight into it, kind of naively and blindly, but I'm now about to get a book published. So I think there was, in some ways there were limitations, but then there were also the lack of limitations that I try to use to my advantage and my benefit.
That's great. Well, congratulations on your book. I'm excited to read it. If you are just joining us, you're currently watching Cults and Conspiracies live on Super News. I'm your host, Dash Finley, and my guest today is Fleur Edwards, a former member of the Children of God cult. If you're not familiar with what that means, we've prepared a little video clip for you, and we'll discuss it further when we get back.
Okay, we're back. There's gotta be a way. There's gotta be a way how one person can stand up to a group. And I found that equalizer in edged weapons.
The Children of God cult was founded by charismatic pastor David Berg, later known as Moses David. He preached a message of free love, but in reality, he promoted abuse and held total sexual control over his cult members. Nothing was off limits: adultery, group sex, incest, and even pedophilia, as long as the cult continued to grow.
How can you do that to kids? How can you do that to kids and sleep at night?
Their main recruitment practice was known as flirty fishing, an elegant term for forced prostitution of young women.
God damn it, that was nasty.
Amongst their most disturbing moments, the cult published a 762-page book with sexually explicit photos of an underage Ricky Rodriguez.
Nobody deserved that. Especially not a kid that age. God damn.
I'm Aaron Paul from The Path, and you're watching Cults and Conspiracies.
There you have it. So, Fleur, do you keep in contact at all with any of the other members of the family?
Aside from my siblings, not so much. I did actually join Facebook for that reason, and I ended up connecting with a lot of my childhood friends, so only through social media.
Okay, is that an intentional thing? Would you like to keep a distance between that?
No, I like talking to them. Some of them are doing really well. Some haven't been doing so well. There have been a fair amount of suicides, and I hear about those sometimes. But no, I like being in contact with them on some level. It's fairly distant, and we don't talk about things too much. When I do publish things or I do things like this, I get feedback from them, and they always say thank you. They're happy that I'm talking about it, and I'm, I guess, willing to put the story out there. A lot of them actually won't even talk to people about it. So when I published my article, I got a random message from a girl who said, just wrote me and said thank you. I can now tell my therapist about this, because she couldn't even find the words to explain what happened. Another girl said, thank you, I was able to share this with my husband, and now our relationship is much better, because he knew something was up but he didn't know what. So I think telling the story is helpful, and the fact that they find some comfort in it is fulfilling for me too.
That's great. Well, you're doing a great service in that respect for sure. But if there were, let's say, a young person out there who maybe was raised in a cult themselves and is now entering the outside world for the first time, as you once did, what advice would you give them? What would you tell that person?
Wow, that's a tough one. I have to say, traditional therapy hasn't worked for me. I've actually never been able to see a therapist. I think the reason why is because if I sit down with someone and start telling them the story, they just end up becoming really fascinated. I mean, here I am, I've done multiple things like this where it's not something you can sit around and talk about in a therapist's office. I think also because we kind of grew up on the fringe of society, those traditional methods don't work. They simply don't work. I think the best advice I would give is to find a way to heal, whatever that may be. I mean, there's all different modes of healing. Also find some sort of community, some sort of support, because one thing about growing up in a cult, amidst everything else that you have, there is this sense of support. I I mean, we grew up communally. We grew up in houses where there were so many people. There was always someone there, even though, you know, there was a lot of, you know, wrong things that went on. So I think finding support and finding a way to heal are two things. Another thing would also be careful. Once you've been in that situation or environment, it's easy to get sucked back into it. So I know it's a fairly typical pattern that a person who has been in a cult, whether they were born into it or have joined it, they will easily join another one. Partly because they might be mentally weak, but also because the predators from the other cults or groups see the weakness in them. So, for example, when someone goes out to recruit someone, they can see if that person is going to be willing to follow them. Do you understand?
Right.
So I would say be wary of other cults, other groups, or even just other people that might want to control your life.
Interesting. And with that in mind, is there any modern offshoot of Children of God, or any of the members, is anyone still active in terms of actually practicing this stuff?
I've heard mixed opinions on that. From what I've heard when I was a few years back was that it was completely done, completely over. Recently, someone told me that, no, they're still around and you can contact them. I think they might have an office somewhere, but that part I don't really keep in contact with. It doesn't really matter to me whether they're still going or not. The leader is dead. My book will be coming out. I don't know who may or may not contact me about that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, hopefully not.
Yeah.
Let's leave it at that. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I would like to thank our wonderful guest, Flora Edwards. Flora, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next week, we will be joined by a former member of the Buddhafield sect, the sexually motivated alternative community featured in the acclaimed documentary Holy Hell. Through our discussion, we'll aim to gain a different perspective on the dramatic process of escaping the clutches of a cult. Also, if you've enjoyed today's discussion of cults and conspiracies, I strongly recommend that you check out Hulu's original series, The Path, streaming now. I've been your host, Dash Finley, and until next week, thanks for watching.
My name is Eddie, and I was in a cult.
You have the light to shape the world around you.
Was it emotional to see Eddie
come back home?
There was a man following us.
I could turn you in.
You won't, because then it's over.
There's a single thing that you can do to get me to walk away from